host it in an API, and they can use Python for that. Or maybe you're building a web application, and you want to add a little bit of machine learning to it. So we'll be mixing a little bit of this. In terms of web frameworks, we'll be using both Flask and Django. And those are both kind of very prominent technologies to use for building backends. And then we'll be doing a little bit of React, because surprisingly, if you need to build a front end for your web application, you need to use JavaScript, and technologies like React, Angular, and Vue are increasingly popular. And then we'll include a little bit of Postgres in our application. It's the most popular database used by Python developers. And we'll do a little bit of virtual environments. So if you're not familiar with virtual environments, they're a way to isolate your packages and dependencies. Very popular tool used by Python developers. And then also Docker, very common technology used by Python developers. Actually, Docker was first announced in a lightning talk at PyCon, so it kind of grew out of the Python community. So we're going to be taming all of this technology using my favorite tool, Visual Studio Code. And if you're not familiar with Visual Studio Code, it's a free cross-platform and open source editor from Microsoft. It's fast and lightweight. It's got great extensions and support for multiple languages. And actually, it's got built-in support for JavaScript and TypeScript with things like IntelliSense, debugging, and source control. And then the team I work on, we build the Python extension, which gives you all those great, rich capabilities, but for Python developers. And the Python extension is actually, it adds rich support for many of the things you need, like IntelliSense, debugging, linting, testing, and refactoring. It's got support for virtual environments, which we mentioned before, and other environments like Conda, pipenv, pyenv, poetry. Nice to see poetry just added to that list recently. Support for formatting tools like Black, AutoPep8, and YAP. Linters like PyLint and Flake8. And this is the most popular extension on the Visual Studio Code marketplace. And actually, I'm very happy to see recently that Visual Studio Code is now the top free tool used by Python developers in the PSF's 2018 developer survey. So we're very excited about what we're doing with Python. And I'm even more excited about the new Visual Studio Code remote development features that we just announced this past week. And that's really why I'm including a lot of containers in this talk, because we've announced these new features that allow you to work as a developer in workspaces and environments that you couldn't work before by separating Visual Studio Code's UI from all the extensions in the back end of the Visual Studio Code development experience. Allows you to develop inside of containers in Windows Subsystem for Linux or over remote SSH connections and get a development experience that's just like your local development experience. So we'll be spending a lot of time with that today. Now, putting all of this together, what we'll be building is a Tweeter application. The first part of the talk, we'll be building a sentiment analysis API from scratch using some Python libraries in Flask. And we're going to deploy that to Azure Web Apps. And then we're going to add a full stack Django REST framework with React application that talks to a Postgres database. And we're going to deploy that to Azure Web Apps for containers. And then in the last few minutes of the talk, we'll just go briefly through how to set up an Azure pipelines deployment pipeline to take this code from GitHub and push it up to Azure. So the first part, like I said, we'll do a little bit of hello world, getting started with VS Code, and build that API and deploy it. Then we'll go through the new remote features using dev containers. And we'll open an existing dev container that I have cloned from GitHub, and we'll deploy that. And then finally, like I said, setting up that CI/CD, running some tests, and deploying a Docker image. All right. So let's get started with the first part. And that's enough talking for me, and I like to jump right into the demo. Let's show you how you can get started building a sentiment analysis API in Flask. And I like to get started right here from the command prompt. So assuming I've got VS Code installed, this is how I like to develop. It usually adds code to the command line here. We'll just make a new folder for our sentiment API. And I really hope I can remember all the code, but the tools will help me. So there's nothing here. So to get started, I can type code space dot. That will open Visual Studio Code from the command line and open up this folder in Visual Studio Code. Now, if you didn't open it from the command line, you can open it a folder here by clicking Open Folder or File Open Folder. It's generally good to work inside of a folder with VS Code. because we can store various settings about your workspace, understanding of where your imports are and things like that, rather than just working with one file at a time. So really recommend this way to get started. Now, the first time you get started with VS Code, you can just click the Python link there to get a link to the Python extension. And so you can install that from the marketplace. I already have it installed. One other thing I want to call out here is that there's a good quick start here in the extension just to show you how to get going and set up your virtual environment. Pro tip, click on the Python version in the status bar. A lot of people don't know that, but it's very useful. And things like that. And it also links off to our tutorial if you want to go more in depth in exploring all the features. But you're watching my talk, so this is the tutorial for you. All right, so to get started with Python, I'm going to open a new file. We'll just call this hello.py. And right when I do that, as soon as I open a Python file, it activates the Python extension. So if you're not seeing Python features in VS Code, you have to open a Python file first, because otherwise we don't know that you want to work with Python. Once I activate the Python extension, I'll try and zoom in a little bit here. I can type print hello world. I can save that and then right-click and say run Python file in terminal, and that will run hello world. Okay, so that's how you build code with Python and the VS Code Python extension. So I'm going to start building up my sentiment analysis API here. And to do that, I need to use the text blob package. I need to install that text blob package. Now I could do that by going to the command line and saying pip install text blob. But then this is going to install it globally, and that might install some dependencies that other applications on my machine might have conflicting versions and things like that. So I want to start by creating a virtual environment for this application, which will contain all my packages. Now to do that, I can run Python to create a virtual environment, and I'm going to do that using py-3 on Windows. This guarantees I'm running Python 3. So if you don't have Python on the path, by the way, you can just type py, and that will give you Python. So I'm going to run py-3-m, which says run a module. I'm going to run the virtual environment module called venv, and then I'm going to pass it an argument env to say I want to create that environment. So you can see VS Code has helpfully said, hey, do you want to use this virtual environment for your workspace? And we can select yes. So that will then change in the status bar that virtual environment. So that's now the active interpreter being used by VS Code. Now I mentioned you can click on that if you want to change it. You can see I've got tons of different versions of Python installed on my machine. But yeah, we kind of help you out there. Now to activate this virtual environment in the terminal, I can type env scripts activate. And then now if I say which Python, you can see it's running Python out of this virtual environment. Also, once I have this activated, if I just create a new terminal, we automatically will run an activate script for you on the command line. So if you say which Python, we have that. So the key there is to get this virtual environment selected in VS Code, and then you can start doing things like installing the text blob package that I want to use. So once I install that text blob package, it'll pull down some of the packages that this depends on. So this actually is a wrapper over NLTK, Natural Language Toolkit. It's a really nice API that lets us start playing with some natural language things. So now I can import text blob. And you know what? I'm going to actually change that and say from text blob import text blob. You can see I get nice auto completions here as I'm writing my code. And let's just play with this a little bit. So let's create a new text blob and say, this is amazing. And let's see what that looks like if I just print that out. I can see the result. So I can select this piece of text here and just press Shift-Enter. And that will open a new Python REPL in my terminal, and it'll run that piece of code. And you can see it says, this is amazing. OK. That's cool. So you can see I can add in .sentiment there. I can run that again. And you can see it gives us a polarity. So 1.0 presumably means positive. And if I change this to say Perl is not great, let's try this. OK, so that's negative sentiment there. OK, got it. So I think I figured out how to use this sentiment analysis library. Now let's build a little Flask API so I can call this from an external web server and be able to submit some messages to it and get the results back here. So let's create a new a Flask app called app.py. This is the default name that you should use for Flask apps. Otherwise, you have to set up some config and things like that, which we don't want to do. And I can type out the Flask code. I do have it memorized, but I also want to show you how to use something called snippets. So I have a snippet that I've added to my application called Flask app that I just press tab, and that creates a new Flask app for me. It's only a few lines of code. And you can define your snippets by going File Preferences, User Snippets there, and you can parameterize them and things like that. So I've got this basic Flask app defined there. Now if I want to run this, I can say Flask. You know what? I probably should install Flask before I try and run it. So I can pip install Flask just like I installed the other package. Let's give that a go. And we can do Flask run. Now if I go to, so it's running the server on localhost, I can control-click this and it will open my browser. Hello universe. All right, we're not satisfied with hello world anymore, by the way. We got to go bigger. OK, so this is working. Let's go back to our text blob package. Now let's pull some of this code into our Flask app. So we want to, now instead of just taking nothing, we can take a message, right? So that's how you define a parameter. Let's pass that message into our API. And let's move the text blob import to the top. Shift-tab. All right, so now we want this API to analyze this message. You know, I copy-paste a lot of my own code. So that's just how I do it. So, OK, let's start by assuming that sentiment is positive, right? Always assume positivity, unless we have any data to indicate otherwise. So let's pass the message to that sentiment, and then we'll say if the polarity is less than 0, then sentiment is negative. All right, and then let's just return the sentiment from the API. Let's Control-C and rerun that again. And now we can say, this is amazing. And we have our sentiment analysis API written in Flask. Wonderful. All right. So let's go ahead and deploy this API to Azure so it's available to the world. So we can do that using a new feature. I've got the Azure CLI installed. Just search Azure CLI and install whatever you find there, as long as it comes from a Microsoft website, by running azwebapp up-n ms-build sentiment. So this is the website it's going to be hosted on. So if I just run that command, it'll take this. Oops, I forgot one thing. Yeah, terminate the bash hub. So I can, first I need to freeze my requirements into a requirements.txt file. So I run pip freeze and put the output to requirements.txt, and that gets all the packages that I've used with their exact version numbers, so that when I deploy it, it's guaranteed to work. So I'll run azwebapp up. So this deploys this app to Azure Web Apps. What it does is it'll use the requirements.txt file to figure out which packages my app depends on. It'll zip up the code, and then on the server side, it will install the packages found in the requirements.txt file. And this will just take a minute. And while that's doing that, I'm going to do a quick recap of what we talked about. So just a quick recap. We installed the Python extension. We created a new file. We ran that file in the terminal. Then we used Shift-Enter to run the selection in the terminal. Then we created a virtual environment, and we used snippets to create a Flask application. Just some tips on using virtual environments. The instructions are actually different on Mac and Windows. So on Windows, use Py-3. On Mac and Linux, use Python 3. Pretty soon, you'll be able to use Python 3 on Windows if you install Python through the Windows Store. So I'll be looking forward to that. And then if you want to install packages into your virtual environment, you can use pip install -r requirements.txt, and then freezing the package. And if you want to get out of the virtual environment, run deactivate. Now, I used virtual environment here with Visual Studio Code. We also support pyenv, pipenv, conda, and et cetera. And then we ran AZ web app up. Azure Web Apps, this deploys to Azure Web Apps for Linux. If you want a free tier of Azure Web Apps, you can pash --skew b1. That'll run it on the lowest tier. So as of build, this is now a GA service for Python, and you get one free tier, one free b1 instance from your subscription. So let me just pop back here. It's taking a moment here to deploy my API. All right, let's go. OK, it just finished. All right, I talked a bit too fast this time. Right, so our API is just finished. It's deployed to msbuildsentiment.azurewebsites.net. And we can see that comes up here. And so here we go. This is amazing, and Perl is not great. Try not to be too harsh. OK, awesome. So one thing we want to do before we move on, if we want this application to be available to other applications to calls, we want to enable cross-origin site calls. So let's hop over to the portal here and take a look. By default, this app is deployed to this app service Linux resource group. And if you're not familiar with what a resource group is, it's just a folder that contains your resources in Azure, so you can group related resources together. In this case, the AZ web app up command has picked a default one, and so there's the app that our app is deployed to. And then to enable cross-origin calls, we just search for cores here, and then we press start. It says any website can call this API without getting an error in the browser. We'll hit save, and that's just going to save us some time a little bit later. OK. Now let's talk about developing using containers. So as I mentioned, we have the new remote containers extension that allows us to get a great containerized development environment. But why would we want to do that? So there's a couple of different reasons. If you think about your getting started steps at your company, if you want to start a new developer on the team, and they walk through all the steps on that getting started guide, usually one of their first actions is to update the getting started guide to fix all the broken instructions. If you have a containerized development environment, you can define all of the things that you need to use in your in all the packages, all the tools, and things like that, and it just minimizes the amount of time that you spend getting going. The other thing is that a lot of people don't like installing a lot of dependencies on their machine because they might cause issues or things like that. So containers can help minimize dependencies installed on your dev machine. And then for deploying, if it works locally, it'll work in production. So the only downside, or the main downside, is that tooling with these environments can be kind of a challenge. Your code's inside of a container. How do I edit that? How do I get IntelliSense? How do I get debugging? And so that's what we've really solved with the remote containers ability. What it does, as I mentioned, is that your UI runs on your local machine there on the left. And then there's a server that we run inside of the container that runs your extensions. It talks to the file system, and it can talk to other containers that get spun up alongside your dev container. And so this allows you to get a user interface that feels just like you're developing on your local laptop. And so let's just take the app that we built, and let's just quickly rebuild it inside of a dev container. So this is where we left off, right? We had our app with our sentiment analysis API. So if I want to add a dev container here, I can, I forgot. I need to switch over to VS Code Insiders for now, because this is only available in the Insiders edition of Code. Code Insiders is a separate side-by-side install of VS Code. It's the daily development build. This will be available in a stable build in a couple of weeks. So in here, I have the remote containers extension installed, and that gives me this little button in the bottom left-hand corner that says Open Remote Window. So I get this menu, and I want to create a new dev container. So I want to select Create Container Configuration File. And this allows us to pick from a bunch of templates. In my case, I want to select Python 3. And then if we look over here, that creates a bunch of these files here. I've got a dev container JSON, I've got a Docker file, and if I open, and this just does standard things like it installs our requirements.txt into the container. So one thing I want to do on this container before we open it is I want to specify my app port to be 5000 because that's the port my Flask application listens on. And now I can select this and say reopen this folder in this container. And so that will create a new instance of Visual Studio Code. And it will build that Docker container. It will install the VS Code remote server. It will install the extensions that are specified in the dev container.json. And then it will give me a development environment here. So we can see here that it's running some Docker build commands. Give it a second. And a lot of the neat thing here is that Docker is built in a set of layers. So it's sort of that build on top of each other. This one builds on top of a Python 3 image, and then it adds some things in. So if I just make some small tweaks to this container, it doesn't have to rebuild it all from scratch. It can use a lot of the cached layers there. And I'm guessing, I don't know what that means. Hopefully I don't have a Docker error. Let's take a look at what containers are running on my machine here. Okay. That's odd. Okay, that was a fluke. All right. All right, so now this is opened inside of this development container, and now I can see my files. But when I'm opening these files, I'm not actually editing these files locally. I'm editing them inside the container. So if I select my Python interpreter, now I get Python interpreters that are in /user, local, bin, Python, et cetera, et cetera. And if I open a terminal, I get a terminal inside of the container. So if I do ls and all these things, so I've got a development environment here that I can use. And if I get my IntelliSense, my debugging, and all sorts of things actually comes from within that container. Okay, so that was kind of a hello world of containers. Let's move on to something a little bit more complicated. So just a quick recap. To do this, we ran code insiders because this is an insiders. We opened the command palette using Control-Shift-P, and then we ran the create container configuration file command. We added port 5000, and then we reopened the folder in the container. So let's switch over to something a little bit more complicated. That is our Django and React container. I lost my command prompt. OK. So here I've got a folder that I've cloned from GitHub. This code's available. It's just a fresh clone. And I'm going to open it using Code Insiders. And if we take a look, this defines a more complicated development environment. And to work with this environment, I don't need anything installed locally on my machine other than Docker. I just need this dev container. So in this case, we're using a Docker Compose file, which actually defines multiple containers that we want to start. And if we actually look inside the Docker Compose file, I'll use Alt-click here to do a nice side-by-side tab. This contains an app container as well as a database container, which contains Postgres. And so this app container, let's just reopen so let's reopen this folder in the container and build this development environment. The container contains Python. It contains Node.js for building our React front end. And then the Postgres database, right? So again, in this case, it's running Docker Compose up to build the container, and then our files will appear momentarily. So there we go. That was nice and fast. So again, I'm working with all of these files inside of the app container. So if I create a new terminal, I can now use npm. I don't have to have Node installed on my development machine. I could say npm install, which I've actually already done that to save a bit of time. But I can build my front end by typing npm run dev. And so this is really cool. I can start my Django web server here by saying Python manage py. Actually, I need to initial, if I start my Django web server, it'll tell me that there's an error because I haven't set up my database yet. So I can initialize my database by saying Python manage py migrate, which will apply the database migrations from my Django application. Django has a ORM where you specify all of your data as models, and then it creates a database from that. So running the Django migrate command will then apply those models and create database tables from them. And then we can load some initial data here. Initial data. So as I'm typing, it's communicating to a server inside of the container, and then just getting back to the UI all of the messages. So everything that works in the Python extension or in VS Code automatically just works here. So now I can manage py run server. And so an interesting point here, this is actually binding to the IP address 0.0.0.0, which, because my code's running inside of the container. And that's the IP address you want to bind to if you're binding to localhost, but you also want connections to be available from external incoming clients. So now if we come back here and say localhost 8000, now we get this beautiful React Django application that just works. I've given this to other people on my team, and they can just follow the same steps, and they get the same application every single time. All right, let's add a tweet. Okay, I'll keep saying this is amazing. Okay, so if we added this tweet, it didn't work. Okay, why didn't it work? Okay, it says I must be logged in. Well, I don't want to log in. Let's see if we can debug this a little bit and see if we can have a default user so that we can always play with the application here for demo purposes at least. So to start debugging, I'm going to move over to the debug tab here, and I want to add a debug configuration. Now this isn't remote debugging, this is local debugging. It's just that VS Code is running remotely. So this is actually very straightforward. So I select add configuration, I'll select Django, and then this generates your standard Django debug configuration. I don't need to modify anything here. And then let me just make sure I've Control-C'd that. Okay. We can click play, and that will start the debugger. So now I'm debugging my application pretty easily. And let's go ahead and set a breakpoint, but I need to figure out where to set a breakpoint. So let's do some code navigation. So if I press Control-P, it'll allow me to browse through a lot of the files on my workspace. I can type views there to go to my views file. I can press pound to see all of the symbols in my workspace, for example. So if I wanted to find user, let's find something with user. Let's go there. And if you scroll down here, we can say this is where we actually create the tweet. If I want to look at other symbols in this file, I can press @ which will just let me navigate symbol by symbol kind of through this file one at a time. So here's some cool code navigation things we can do. All right, so if I want to set a breakpoint and debug this tweet creation, I just click, put a little red dot there on the left-hand side. And let's try this again, click tweet. Look at that, we hit our breakpoint. So let's see what we can do here on this user object. So let me pop open the debug console, and now let's start poking at this object. So I can say self.request. So I get auto completions in my debug console as I'm typing here, and I can type expressions into the debug console, and I can expand variables, and I can see, in this case, the is anonymous is true. Let's see if we can pick a default user that we want to use. Let's see if we can get Bob as our default user. So I can write a little expression here to query the database. So I can say user.objects.filter first name equals Bob, and we'll just put dot first. And if I press enter there, we can see that returned our user Bob. Okay, so let's see if we can return this user instead. All right. Let's press stop, go back. Coding on high resolution is kind of an art by itself. All right, so we'll say if user.is anonymous, then we could say user equal user.objects. All right, let's go back to the terminal and rerun that. And let's see if we can now, okay, so now we can tweet from our application. That's fun. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, I started an NPM script that built our front end. This is actually running in watch mode, so I can go ahead and I can start editing the JavaScript here inside the container and get my React developer tools. So if I browse through my files here, I can go, well, let's just go to our tweets.js. I did Control P there. And let's see if we can add that sentiment API into the application. So I've got a React component here called sentiment that what it does is that you pass it the text, and when the component loads, it will make an API call to the API we just built, and when it gets it'll get back the positive or negative sentiment, and then until it receives a response, it'll just show an empty div, and then when it gets a response, it'll render the div with the sentiment. So if we go down into our HTML code here, we can just add this sentiment component. So I'm getting my React auto-completion here. So it's one of the great things about VS Code is it's got great support for multiple languages. And then I can say tweet.text. Beautiful. All right. Press save. I can come in here and I hit refresh. And then the sentiment API calls are there. And then let's go back to our go-to bashing on Perl. OK. So that's all working. That's cool. Now let's run some tests. So I've got tests that I've defined in this application in my test.py file. If I want to configure VS Code to use these tests, I can use Control-Shift-P to run a command and say Python configure tests. These tests are built using the PyTest framework, so I can select PyTest, and then they're in the tweeter folder. So that will initialize tests here. I get these cool code lenses inside my application where I can run an entire test class, or I can run individual ones or debug tests. I also get a new test explorer that we've recently added to VS Code, where I can see all of my tests in a tree view. I can run all of the tests like that, or I can run them one at a time. And again, I'm running all of this in this containerized development environment. So I can be like perfectly productive here. And I think that is the main thing. All right, so that was a quick tour of opening an existing application inside of a dev container, working with it, and using a bunch of features. So to do that, we ran the reopen folder in container command. You get a prompt to do that when VS Code opens if there's a dev container folder. And then we opened a new terminal. We installed our node modules, built a front end, and then we opened a second terminal, and we initialized our database and ran our server. And then we added a Django debug configuration. Just a quick tip, if you try this at home and you're not seeing Python show up, just open a Python file first. That'll initialize the Python extension and give you your debug configuration options. And then we used the debug console to inspect some variables, and then we did a little bit of code navigation with Control-P and to open files, symbols, and browse around. And then we configured our tests, and then once we configured our tests, we could use the test explorer or code lenses in our code. All right, so now that was our development container. So something interesting about the development container is that your files are all volume mounted in there. So as I'm making changes inside the container, they're available outside of the container as well. But when you build a container for production, you want to just you just want to copy your files all in there. You want to use a production web server. So we actually need to build a production version of this application. And so let's walk through how we want to do that. So the first thing I want to do is get out of this dev container mode. I can click in the bottom left-hand corner and say reopen folder locally. So that will exit dev container and just open this in a normal, boring desktop sort of version of the application. And we'll ignore this for now. Okay, so if I open my Docker extension tab here, I can see the various containers. I actually just want to stop these because they'll be using the ports that I want to use. So I can right-click and say stop and select all containers. So that'll stop those. So I've got a Docker file here that's my dev container. Now what I want to do is add a Docker file to my main workspace so that I can build up this production Docker container that I want to deploy this app in. So to do that, I'm going to run another command and select Docker, add Docker files to workspace. So I can never remember all the Docker stuff off the top of my head, so this helps me get going with a predefined template. I'll select Python. My app listens on port 8000. So that'll generate a Docker file as well as a Docker Compose file that I can start with. So some things I want to do to this container definition, I want to change a few things. So first of all, I want to build this from an image that somebody else has defined on Docker Hub. So I've got this image. There's a person out there who's created a really good image that hosts an Nginx web server. So I'm getting auto-completions here. This is actually coming from Docker Hub, so I can look up these containers without having to leave my developer tool. So this is an Nginx web server, which it's really fast and efficient. It's really good at serving static files, and it also connects to the Django application using this UWSGI or UWSGI interface. So I don't actually need to start my application. It knows how to find Django in this container. A few things I do need to do is configure a listen port. So I can tell the web server to listen on port 8000. And then I also want to define the static URL where my files will be found. And we'll say tweeter3. Hold on, I just need to check my notes. Yep, static. And then for Django applications, when you deploy them, you need to run a command to collect your static files because you can have multiple different applications. And so if you run Python 3 manage py collect static, that will pull all of your static files from all the different applications into one static folder that we can serve up, which will be this folder here. All right, so one thing I need to do, though, is I still need to build my node front end and package it into this container. So to do that, I can actually use multi-stage builds. So I can say so I can start with a node image, and I can run some commands like npm install. I can run npm run build, which will build my container image. And then the last thing I want to do is actually I want to delete my node modules, so I'm not packaging those up inside the container. So I'm just left with my static front end. And I want to run this inside of a node build folder. And I want to add all of my code into a node build folder. So down here, what I want to do is I want to copy the output of this basically into my second stage of the container. Basically, as soon as I say from this Docker container, it throws away everything that was generated beforehand. So I actually want to copy. So we'll say workdir app, and I want to say copy, and then from, I get some nice auto-completions from 0 into app. So that will copy the results of this step. Oh. Yeah, there we go. So hopefully I didn't forget anything there. So this is our production container. And then if we go to our compose file, we actually want to define some environment variables. So in this case, we're going to be creating a production Postgres database and a few other things. So we need some secrets and things like that our application uses. So those are, to set our application up with that, we can use this env sample file here, and where we define our database user. So we can say tweeter, we can fill in some things here, actually. Sorry, let me just copy paste this into this sample. So we're just configuring from the command line what usernames and passwords we want to use for our database. So these will be used to connect and create the database. So if you want an easy to remember password that passes the password requirements of Azure, there's a good one for you. And then there we go. And so this .env file is a standard way to define environment variables. And actually, when I run my application, Django will actually pick this file up and use it to configure it for a production configuration. So if I want to create the database, I've got a script here that I've created that will load this .env file and create a Postgres database in Azure using the variables here. Now I can create the database using the portal, but this just allows me to create the database and then also instantiate my app using the same credentials. So that'll go ahead and spin that up. So we've started creating the Postgres database. This takes a minute, so I'm going to also build my container at the same time. So back to my compose file. Sorry, I switched back and forth there. I want to say when I start the container up, use that .env file that I've created that will configure it to point at the right database and things like that. So to build this container, I can right-click and say compose up. That will build the application. And one thing, so this will build it with this image name here, Python sample tweeter app. But I actually want to push this application up to a Azure container registry that I've created so that I can deploy it to my web app. So to do that, I want to update this and say Python demos.azurecr.io, which is the name of a registry that I've created. This can be it could be Docker Hub or whatever, but this is a private container registry that I've created. So 1 second here. And just to show you what that looks like, if we go back to our Azure portal, if we go to our resource groups, and we open our Python demos account, there's the container registry that I've created. So if I want to be able to push to this registry, I just need to open my access keys and copy the secret for that. And then I can log into this from the prompt by typing docker login python demos.azurecr.io. And I've already got my credentials saved, but it would prompt you for a password, and then you'd authenticate. So I've got a bunch of stuff running in parallel here. I'm creating my Postgres server. I'm building my container. And I always mistype that for some reason. Collect static. All right, so let's right-click, compose up this again. So that will build that container there, and let's check in on our database. So that's still working. That's fine. So now I want to push this image that I've created up to our Azure Container Registry. And I can use the Docker extension to browse the images that I've created locally. This is the one that I just built there with compose up. And so I can select this image and select push. And that will push it up to the container registry. You can see it's already got a version of this cached. It's only pushing the 50 megabytes or so delta that I've created here. All right, this is still running. We'll give that a second. All right. So while that's running, we can poke inside of our container. Oh, man, it finished just in time. All right. So this container is running locally, and I've got my database created. Now I need to initialize that database. When I ran this locally, I ran manage py migrate to generate the database tables. I need to do that same thing in Azure. But I need to be running in an environment that has my environment variables, my passwords, and things like that set up. So if I go to my Docker tab, here I can get into this container by right-clicking and saying attach shell. So when I do that, I get a command prompt that's running inside the container, and my environment variables are mapped in here. So now if I run Django manage py migrate, it'll now be generated pointing at the production database. Now, it gives me this error that says no PGAH conf entry for this host. This just basically means that my IP address needs to be added to a firewall rule to that production database. My script is supposed to do that, but I'm a tricky employee that's connected through a VPN, so that's throwing off what Azure thinks my IP address is. And so I can browse my resources in Azure, go to my Python demos resource group, where I've provisioned that database. I can go into my connection security, and then I can just update the allow my IP address rule to use my IP address. But I'm going to actually add a range here because I happen to know that my IP address bounces around between different values. So I'm just going to add a range of IPs for the Microsoft subnet here. So I'll save that. But just a pro tip, you can use the error output here to figure out what your real IP address looks like to Azure. So now that I've set that, I can migrate my database. I can generate it, so it's now applying the migrations to that production database. Let's give it a second here. And once that finishes, I can load some initial data into it. All right, let's take a look at this local container here running. So now this is running locally, but it's talking to the production database that I just initialized. So I'm just checking to make sure that this app works on my local machine before I ship it off to production. So it's working here. That's great. Now I can deploy this image and create a new web application from it. So now I mentioned I pushed this image earlier to Azure Container Registry. I can use the Docker extension to actually browse my, my registry. I can sign in. So I just click the sign into Azure button here. This will be nice and simple. So I just sign in, and then it tells me I'm now signed in, and I can close this. So when I come back to VS Code, I can see my Python demos registry that I've created there in Azure. There's that Tweeter app image that I just published. And then I can right-click on this, and I can select Deploy Image to Azure App Service. So that'll create a new Azure App Service from this, configured to use this container image. So I want to put it in that Python demos resource group. We'll select an existing app service plan here, which basically just allows me to share one VM to host multiple websites. And then we'll call it Tweeter app ms build for the name of the front end. So that's going to go ahead and deploy that. Now, one thing I still need to do after I create this new web app is I need to apply the environment variables that I have locally. The .env file I have is not checked in here. It's just for the local environment. If you notice, I've actually added it to the gitignore file so I don't accidentally check it in when I'm typing in passwords in there. So if I go to my Azure tab, this is added by the Azure App Service extension. I can start to explore my Tweeter app here. And if I open my application settings, these are the environment variables that are on my application. I can right-click, and I can upload the local settings, and I can select that same .env file I've been using to apply my environment variables. So this will take all of the configuration and all the settings that I have. It will apply it to that web app, so it's got all the right passwords and things like that. And then I can browse to this website here, and it will give it a second, and it'll load up. So when I browse to this website, it's actually pulling down that container. It takes a little bit of time the very first time. Actually, that was quite quick. Wow, I love being pleasantly surprised. So there's my application with my React app connected to my Postgres database, talking to my sentiment analysis API. It's all here, and I can, again, say, this is amazing. Cool, and it's coming from Bob. So that was the change we just made. All right, that was a lot of stuff. Let's do a quick recap to catch up on where we are. So we use the .env files to store our settings and secrets. This is local only. You should delete this file when you're done. And then in our settings production py file, I didn't actually show this, but in there we configure it to use the production database. And the way we actually told it to use a production database is there's an environment variable that tells Django which configuration to run in. So we set the .env file set a production environment variable. Then we use this create_db script to create the database. And then we created the production Docker file that used multi-stage builds to build the Node app and then build the Python app on top of that. Once we defined those files, we did a compose up to build it. And then we attached into the container locally and ran our database migrations from the production container locally to initialize the production database. And then I'm missing the step where I actually right-click and deployed from Azure Web Apps. It might be out of order in the slides. So we created a container registry, and then we did a Docker login to get access to that. And then we set the image name in the compose YAML so that we prefix the image name with the container registry so that when we push, it knows where to deploy it to. And then from there, we right-clicked on the container registry and said deploy image to Azure App Service. And we browsed, and well, we didn't have to wait that long for it to come up, so that's good. So in the last few minutes, I want to talk about how we set up CI/CD for this application with Azure Pipelines. So if you're not familiar with Azure DevOps, it's actually a suite of services for building for developer tools, right? So there's a few different things. There's Azure Artifacts, which actually gives you a private package feed. So if you're building Python packages and distributing them internally, you can use Azure Artifacts you can use it for both a private and a public feed. And then there's Azure Pipelines, which gives you hosted builds. So we're going to be using that to deploy the app. And there's also Azure Repos for source control and then boards for work and issue tracking. Now, just a quick note on Azure Pipelines. If you're using an open source project, you get 10 parallel builds for free with open source projects, and you get Linux, Mac, and Windows build machines. So this has actually been very useful to the open source community. Popular Python projects like Python itself is actually using Azure Pipelines for CI. Pandas, you may have heard of Pandas, and a bunch of other Python packages have been using Azure Pipelines because of this free hosted builds. And you can connect it to deploy from GitHub or Azure repos, and you can define your build steps using YAML files that are in your repo. So I've got a couple of those set up here. Let's take a look. So from my application here, I've got two YAML files that define my pipeline. I've got a CI pipeline. Here, this defines some tests that I want to run. So remember those tests that I had set up in my test explorer earlier. So this just basically defines a set of steps that I want to take in my pipeline. It says trigger master, so this whenever a code change is committed to the master branch of my repo, it'll trigger this continuous integration pipeline to come on. This is a matrix that says I want to test with both Python 3.6 and 3.7. And then we have a set of steps. The first thing is this use Python version step, which allows us to pull in whatever Python version we want to use with Azure Pipelines. So if we want to use Python 2 or Python 3, this build task here will pull down the right version of Python. And then it can run scripts. So this script here can install our requirements.txt, and then it installs the PyTest, and a PyTest Azure Pipelines plugin that was actually made by Anthony Shaw, who's a member of the Python community. And then finally, it runs PyTest there. So let's actually just jump over to our build pipeline. So I'm in dev.azure.com. Anyone can go to dev.azure.com, and that's how you get started. You can create one of these things. If you go to pipelines and builds, you can get started creating a new pipeline just by selecting new and going new build pipeline. And then that will allow you to select a GitHub repo. So I can click on GitHub. that will just give it 1 second here. So it's got my repository here. Here's that Tweeter app repo. And so you can click here to generate a YAML template if you don't already have one. And this will actually check in a YAML file into your GitHub repo, so that's nice and convenient. In this case, I'll select existing Azure Pipelines YAML file, and then I can select the CI pipeline that I have here. I've already set that up, so I'm just going to imagine I clicked continue here. And then if I go back to my builds, you can see there's the Tweeter app tests. And so this runs whenever I check in a code change. You can see there's the Python 3.6 and the 3.7 version of that. And I can actually view my test output here by going to the tests. And I can see it ran 6 tests. They all passed. And I can look at all the past tests here by filtering, changing the filter. What did I click on? Oh, there we go. I can see each test that ran and how long it took. So if this pipeline succeeds, then I've got another pipeline here set up that does my deployment. So this is part of this deploy pipeline. This basically just pulls in our Docker container. It pulls it down. It logs in. It builds it. And it runs the container. And then it actually runs a migrate here. So if I have any changes to my database, this will automatically apply those changes as part of the deployment pipeline. And then it just simply pushes the container, and that will update it in update the image used by the Azure Web App. So if I go here and we just take a look at the multi-stage build pipeline, we can see all those steps succeeding. And so now for secrets, in order to pass the secrets into these build queue here, so for example, if we look at the Docker login step, you can see it says Docker login, $ Docker login password. So you can't see the secret here in the terminal. The way we specify those is if we go to the edit pipeline, we click in that step there, and we look at our variables. I actually went in and edited all the passwords here, this ACR key, my database password, and you can just click that there's this icon here that lets you lock these, and if you unlock them, it doesn't let you get the secret back out again. So if I tried to unhide this password here, I wouldn't be able to get at it. So that's like a one-time thing that you put in. So if you delete the end file, you can kind of put your secret in there. Okay. And so that was a quick run through of how you set up those pipelines. So let's switch back and do a quick recap, and then we'll wrap it up. So to create a new pipeline, you can go to dev.azure.com. You can select an existing GitHub repo, and then you can pick a YAML file, or you can add a YAML file into your repo. That'll define a bunch of steps that get run inside of those YAML files, and then you can store secrets inside of environment variables in the portal. All right, so we're nearing the end of the talk. That was a tour of building this Tweeter application and taking it using dev containers to get a nice productive local development environment using containers, and then deploying that to Azure. We talked about AZ Web App Up as a quick way to deploy to Azure Web Apps, and then we used a bunch of tools to build a production Docker container, deploy that to Azure. Finally, we set up a CI/CD pipeline, and that's sort of the full life cycle. So thank you much for coming today. The repo, all the code that I went through today is here at the Microsoft Python sample Tweeter app. You can learn more about Python and Azure at azure.com/Python. There's a lot of great resources linked to the document.